The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I've been reading a lot about the balance of CBD and THC in products, and the high THC compounds tend to lead to more mental disorders, especially when they're not balanced by CBD. People have more paranoid responses, things like that. And so I feel like with psychedelics, there's definitely the ability to get more into your pain also, which is problematic. They're not just going to help you with your pain unless you help yourself through that. Like they might point out to you, hey, your neck is actually really tense right now. Did you know that? You're like, oh, yeah. But if you don't deal with it, you'll just be in pain and realize, oh my God, my neck feels like shit or whatever.
For me, it's like when I'm not feeling good, I feel it in my brain. Like my thoughts are not as clear, my thoughts are not as streamlined. It can become really difficult to focus for a long period of time on something. And when we went to the river, I really noticed it because I was like lying there for a long time, and I was like the scope of focus that I have to maintain right now has to be so small in order to keep my brain kind of streamlined from running in all these different directions. Do you ever get that?
But how did it tie into the pain that you were experiencing?
I kind of thought that it was, the pain was tied into the mental state. Like the pain was kind of this diffuse inflammation. And inflammation has pretty negative consequences for neuronal health, right? And because I remember when we were teaching that immunology course, it was like the immune system, once activated, creates a cascade of events in the brain that starts to prune neurons and starts to basically like restructure connections. And so I feel like when you're really inflamed for a long period of time, that starts to affect the way that your brain is processing things, because literally these connections are getting rewired.
It's confusing, right? Because inflammation isn't a bad thing. Like when you go running, you get super inflamed. Like I heard some doctor the other day just be like, look, if you hook me up to like an immunology battery while I'm doing heavy exercise, you just gave it to the pathology lab, they would be like, this guy's dying. Like get him into the ER immediately. Like he's going to have a cardiac event or he's going to just go septic or I don't know, whatever. Like you look like you're dying. There's so much inflammation going on. And so it's not just the overall inflammation. There's something particular about the kind of cortisol. I don't know how to describe it. It's very fascinating, though.
I actually think that it's chronic versus temporary. Because if you're running, you're inflamed, but then you peak, and then after you stop running, you come back down to baseline really, really quickly. And so what you're doing is you're activating all of these inflammatory cascades, but they're not being maintained. And when you're in a chronic condition, they're being maintained all of the time. And so there's never a point of being able to actually rest.
Yeah, it's like they're controlled, right? You have control over that inflammation. Like you're turning it on and off essentially by your actions. And breathing, like Wim Hof kind of stuff is similar too, or cold plunges. I mean, whenever I get out of the cold shower, I'm red all over, and that's probably blood flow for the most part, but there's got to be something inflammatory about it too.
I would think that cold would be anti-inflammatory.
It is for sure. That's why you do. But there's got to be I know there's a cortisol response, right?
Interesting.
It feels kind of adrenal when you go in that cold at first. But it's controlled, right? I think you get it under control. Of course, the cold itself, like you said, it constricts the blood vessels and slows down the inflammation too. But there's this whole controlled process of it, I guess is what I'm getting at. It's like you're taking yourself through the steps and then back down again. And it's like something about your conscious possession of your inflammatory cycle in those events, exercise, cold plunge. You're even going into a stressful situation that you can master, like playing a show or doing an interview that's kind of scary with some intense topic. It's like you get a hold, it is inflaming, but then you grab a hold of it. And there's something about that which is really at the heart of what is bad and good about inflammation. The inability to control it is when I think that it starts to rip your body apart.
Which makes sense, right? Because if you're on all the time and there's just all these systems, because I mean the immune system is a really destructive system. I would say that for the most part it's catabolic, right? Because the job that it's doing is it's going around and it's destroying stuff. It's permeating blood vessels, it's permeating tissue, it's allowing things to move from compartment to compartment. And so if that's on all the time, like I can
it's
imagine
like the brain must be responding to, like, what is going on? I don't have control over this, right? The brain has this almost learned helplessness at some point on its inflammatory reactivity. Seems like to me, experientially.
Elaborate on that.
Like it's kind of like, if you learned helplessness, right? In these like horrific animal studies where they'll basically this is all this early psychology when they used to do horrible things, these test subjects.
They probably still do horrible
I'm
things.
sure they do. But there's this well-characterized phenomenon called learned helplessness, right? And I mean, you see this play out in children that are abused and so forth. They become very docile at some point. And I think they were just subjecting like rats to, shocks on the floor or something. And eventually they just kind of give up. Like they just get used to it, essentially. It's a habituation to negative stimuli. And I wonder if something in the brain happens as well, where it's very reactive and plastic, not plastic neuronally, but plasticity in its reaction. It has the ability to switch between reactive and non-reactive very easily. And if it's just continually inundated with reactive stimuli, this what you're calling chronic inflammation, then it just kind of loses that ability and it gets damaged. The neuronal tissue itself is just not as reactive as it needs to be anymore. I wonder. I'm just spitballing here.
Well, I think that it's actually a physical process on the level of, I think it's one of the it's either TNF alpha or one of the interferons that activates these like cellular death cascades. And so the brain is probably busy dealing with the fact that its connectome is being affected. And so instead of, because your brain is doing so many things at once, right? And one of the things that it's doing is it is taking in stimulus from the outside world and connecting it to actions inside the body. And
orienting itself towards a more resonant state with that environment, right?
And when you have a chronic immune response, if what I'm remembering from teaching is correct, then what's happening is that as it's attempting to get into that resonant state, you're messing with its ability to maintain those resonant connections.
Right.
And so as you try to get into the resonant state, the brain's like, oh shit, I'm anthropomorphizing a little bit, but it has to then go through the construction process of actually figuring out how to rewire its network to account for the fact that some connections are missing that are necessary for the resonant state.
Right. And if it's frustrated habitually, right, if it just can't achieve that state no matter what it does, because it's just continually inundated with inflammatory stimuli and with no ability to adjust those because they're coming from all sides, essentially.
Well, because at some point there's a crazy feedback loop where the inflammation causes stress, like cortisol stress. And so it's a perpetual feedback loop, because I've definitely been in this position before where I'm in pain and the pain causes this panicky feeling of, is this never going to go away? And you can tell that that accelerates it and that makes it worse, because it's this closed loop of, I don't feel good. Oh my God, am I ever going to feel good again? And then that makes the I feel worse. And then it's just even if the brain could get let's say, the inflammatory stuff that's on the level of just leaky compartments under control, I don't think that it's able to, in that same breath, be able to get under control the stress, because there's just too many things that it's divided onto, and no one is really strong enough to be able to fully control that easily and immediately without a lot of training.
Or without doing something completely unintuitive, like going for a run when you feel like shit, which is weird because it sucks to go for a run when you feel really inflamed. Like if you have a I get really bad headaches sometimes. The other morning, through the night, I had a bad headache, and then I just was like, all right, whatever, I'm gonna go running, and it sucked, but eventually, when I was done, I actually felt better because I actually probably made it worse. But then by consciously taking control of that and doing something and then coming down from it, I actually recovered, which is interesting. And I think the cold plunge thing is the same thing.
I wonder if when you're exercising, if you aren't activating some deeper program that basically is able to short circuit whatever's happening in the body.
That's what I'm saying. I think the cold plunge too does a really similar thing. I think it's just something about that like ramp and recovery. Because when you stop running, then you stop getting the inflammation of the running that was causing you, or exercising, lifting, cold plunge. As soon as you take control of it, then it comes down, and I think it continues to go down after that.
Well, I think that I see it as kind of like a fixed action pattern. Do you know what those are?
Yeah, of course.
So the fixed action pattern is that, okay, after I exercise, the immune system goes through a down regulation.
Exactly.
And so even if you're chronically inflamed and then you exercise, then what it does is it activates that fixed action pattern that then frees you to be able to ramp. I mean, it's obviously complex, but yeah, the running has been really kind of transformative. I hate it.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard, but it's also kind of addictive.
Yeah, it's crazy, like, getting back into it after not running for 20 years or something, because the first couple of weeks were just so miserable for me personally. I just could hardly make it, a half mile or something. And it was just miserable, and my body hurt so bad. But then you get through that first wall, and it's almost like you've been doing it your whole life. It's just like, oh, this is normal. This is like walking now.
I remember we were watching Zabriskie Point. Do you remember that movie? The one where there's this lady who's driving through the desert and the guy who steals the airplane.
Oh, that's kind of good.
It was
kind of weird.
It was super weird. And they end up in that weird desert area where they're just running up and down these hills. And obviously it's a movie and it's not reflective of real life, but I was just thinking so much about how that must have been a natural state of being when we didn't sit all the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There was a crazy study that I came across, which was that our basal metabolic rates had gone down, I want to say at least 5x since the beginning of the last century. So you basically, sitting would burn more calories 100 years ago than you do today. And people had all these justifications for why that is, high fructose corn syrup, there's something in the water. But I think that it's literally just everybody sits all the time.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine an animal that is able to do that other than human beings in the modern era.
I guess like pandas.
Yeah. Pandas are pretty chill.
Yeah, they're really chill.
But we don't just sit all day, by the way. We sit and stress out about things.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this webpage isn't loading. God damn, what's going on? Okay. It's like that kind of thing. I don't know. I imagine that a lot of people are having these similar experiences. They have jobs, even if they're working remotely, they're working at computers, they're dealing with problems, they're having these visceral reactions to the problems, but they're not actually moving their bodies. We're not. I mean, we're just as guilty as anyone.
What have you been most stressed out about?
I guess just time. Like trying to fit everything into the day is really, I don't know if stress is the right way, but I do perceive it as this sense of angst. I'm like, okay, I have all these things that I want to get done. It's not entirely negative experience for me because I'm really excited about all the things that I'm doing, but just trying to squeeze them in, and then that feeling that there's so much ahead of me that I somehow need to get done before my energy wears out is like a little overwhelming sometimes. But then it's like you exercise, go to the gym, go climbing, whatever, and then it's like gone. It's just like, oh, okay, no problem. Yeah, just this is the path. I'm just doing this. I'm just Okay, next. What's up next? Okay, you gotta edit this thing next. All right, gotta rehearse this set. All right, let's do it. Like, there's something about the stationary, physically being stationary, that makes it more difficult.
Oh man, that's wild because I actually noticed. So I started working out on the kitchen table, and I didn't.
Working out on the kitchen table.
Yeah, a little bit of yoga in the morning, No, because normally I would work in my room, and so I have that lofted table.
Computer work.
Hmm?
Computer work.
Well, what else?
Bench pressing? I don't know.
I would love to have a bench press in that room. No, but so I set up that table so that I could stand at it because I have a really high stool, but the kitchen table is one that you can only really sit at unless you start to really loft things. And so I realized that I had been sitting for, man, almost a week because we got back from California, and then we started working on, we had a bunch of writing that we had to do. We were working on the book, we were working on the court case, we were working on just all of these computer things. And since we were working in the same room, you had figured this out. You had lofted on that giant bin, you'd lofted your computer so you could stand. But I was sitting, and I think that is what screwed me up.
Yeah, probably.
Because I've noticed that there's something about being able to stand and being able to move around that you can stretch, you can kind of figure out like what parts of your body are stuck. You can walk around, you can leave the computer and kind of, stare out the window or just take this microscopic break in order to just interrupt the loaf.
Yeah, it definitely helps. I mean, you can also run into your own problems just standing all day too. So I like to cycle it. I like to sit and stand.
There was a hilarious article. I don't remember where it was. It was in like the New Yorker or the New York Magazine or something. And this guy basically decided that he was going to try this experiment where he didn't sit at all for, I think it was a month. And he nearly lost his goddamn mind by the end of it. Because he was extreme about it. He wouldn't sit for work. He wouldn't sit on the subway. He wouldn't sit when he was eating dinner with his family. He wouldn't sit when he was watching movies. He basically was just, I'm just going to stand all the time. And his body started to hurt and everything was just breaking. And he was psychologically just wearing down from not being able to sit.
I feel that.
Yeah. One of the things is that really kills me is that when we go on these long road trips, so I'm starting to think already about this North American tour that we're planning for next year. And when we've done road trips in the past, we've been pretty bad about taking breaks on long drives. And when I was younger, I don't think that it bothered me as much, where I feel like I could just kind of sit in the car for 6 hours and have it be no big deal. But as I've gotten older, I'm like, I don't want to be on the freeway for 6 hours a day.
I still like it mentally, but I don't like it physically.
But the point for travel for me is this ability, especially in a car. Like if you're in a train, you're being carried along by the current of the train and you're just kind of in the rhythm and it's very soothing. But there's something about being on a freeway for that long where it's kind of ugly. You're surrounded by just that detritus of American corporate life where every single town, all of the signs are the same, all of the shops are the same. There's just this weird corporo structure that's been plopped down at intervals on the freeway that you just pass through, and there's never...
It's very Philip K. Dick. It's like you start feeling like every town's the same and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I've started to get that feeling really aggressively where I go to a new place and I kind of stand around and I'm like, there's nothing that defines this as being distinct from the last place that I was. Nature is not like that, though, because you walk into nature and you're like, oh man, there's all these weird plants here. There's all these weird rocks. There's this story that's on the landscape that's very unique to the location. But you don't get that inside of cities because cities have been progressively optimized to reflect utility for a concrete set of human desires, right? You have to go to the grocery store. You have to go buy stuff for the house. You have to get your gas. You have to get dinner. And all of these things have kind of converged culturally to emulate what is most successful.
Well, it's most comfortable for sure.
I just think that it's this convergence on an algorithmically optimized maximum, right? Like every single Target in every single city that you visit looks exactly the same.
Well, people enjoy the safety of familiarity. I mean, it's very comforting to see something familiar, right? Like people fly into freaking third world countries and look for the McDonald's, because that reminds them of what they know, and it's safe,
I remember in high school, I went on a trip to Japan because I studied Japanese for 2 years. And at the culmination of that, I begged and I pleaded and convinced my parents to let me go on this school trip to Japan. And it was incredible. We were there, I think, for 2 weeks. And it was just, I think it was the first time that I'd ever gone somewhere without my parents, which was really transformative. But a bunch of the kids in the group, we got there. And after a couple of days of eating Japanese food, they were like, we need to go find a McDonald's. And I was like, you're sick.
Mm-hmm.
You just, I could not understand. To this day, I don't understand it. But there are people that crave that. But for me, that's
My grandma freaking loved McDonald's. Like, it was just like a treat or something, you know? And I think my dad loves it too, just to go and get coffee. Like, it's like an event, There's something, like, I don't want to say nostalgic, but so familiar that it's like a relief,
That's how I feel about In-N-Out.
Yeah.
Right? Because, I mean, like, In-N-Out was a foundational pillar of my childhood because my sister and I would stay up really late and we would watch The Daily Show and we would then watch Iron Chef Japan, the really cheesy one that I showed you the other day. And at around midnight, we would both be starving because we had just watched an hour of people preparing these elaborate dishes. And the only place that was open was In-N-Out. So we'd sneak out of the house and we'd go get In-N-Out. And so it's just wired into my brain as this really nostalgic place. And every single In-N-Out is exactly the same. You walk into it, it's the same lighting, the same colors, the same setup, the same organization. And you could be anywhere in the world and you walk into that In-N-Out. And it's just, time stops.
Man, this is like the role that music has always occupied for me. I just have always wondered how the hell people get by without it, because I just feel like I can always pick up a guitar in any situation and like fly back to being 14 years old. It's just, I have the exact same feeling. It's just it's a complete permanent fixture in that sense. It has that McDonald's glow to me.
I feel like books do for me. Like I reread Snow Crash the other day. Did I tell you about this?
Mm-mm.
Oh man, I gave you Cryptonomicon, and you read part of it, but it's I
kind of burnt out on it.
I mean, it's an insane book. It's just so ambitious and big, and you really have to find the time to read it. But the first book of Stevenson's that I read was Snow Crash, and he wrote it in 1991, and it was about this totally corporatized America where everyone had become technologically advanced enough that there was a second layer of society, which was the metaverse. He actually coined the term metaverse in 1991. And people had these computer terminals and they would jack in through the computer terminals to get into this place that was this other world where they had avatars and they would go around and they could do things. And the entire premise of the book is that there's this virus that's going through the metaverse that's actually crashing people in real life. And there's, he has a lot of mythology in it. But I reread it and I was shocked by how good it still was. Because there's a lot of books that I pick up from when I was a kid. Like there's, Dan Simmons wrote this book called Hyperion, which is about this mysterious creature called the Shrike that lives on this planet called Hyperion, and there's all these pilgrims that go see it, but the Shrike kills them. And so there's this group of people that have come together for this pilgrimage because there's this myth, I think, that one person will be able to see the Shrike, and the Shrike will grant them some transcendence of some kind. And so everybody thinks that they're going to be the one person. And so they're on this ship, and the book is told through their stories and what caused them to end up on this pilgrimage. And it was so bad. I remember reading it when I was a kid and being so in love with it, but the writing was just unbearable.
Mm.
And so it's weird because books are the place where I find that solace of childhood, but my tastes have changed. My relationship to it has changed. And I wonder if it's the same for you with music, where your relationship to it when you were 14 is very different now.
It's not, though. That's what's
It's
crazy. Like, the
interesting.
same records that I was in love with then, like, my tastes matured a bit in my teenage years, but I still can listen to really intense, borderline emo music, like Face to Face or NoFX or some punky stuff, and still get into it privately. Like, I wouldn't subject anybody else to it, like in my car. But I can Rage Against the Machine,
You would play that
311,
stuff.
right? Like, I still can get into that
You
stuff.
totally play Rage Against I remember there was a period where you would play Rage in the car when we were driving. That was a difficult period.
But I don't know, like some of the later stuff that I got into in high school, I still love that stuff. I can still listen to some of those 90s bands and just absolutely identify, like it blisses me out still, which is, kind of funny.
But not all of them. There must be some that you go back to and you're like,
I was kind of a snob, I was pretty proud of like having refined my taste when I was getting into all that music. So I don't know. I still think those bands kick ass. Like, I still love REM and Counting Crows and who else? It's these 90s groups, man.
I think that there's some music that I come back to and I realize that the message in the songs isn't really a message that I resonate with anymore. Like the craft might be good, but the emotions or the words or the content is just kind of for me.
Those guys were really good wordsmiths, really good lyricists.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the music from the 90s expressed a sort of alienation and a lack of solution sets. And so there is that where for a long time, actually, when I got into music, especially in my 20s, I thought that there was going to be somebody with answers. Right, I almost treated it like prophecy, like if I like a almost religious, right? Like, especially you get into like Dylan and Van Morrison, Patti Smith, like these people are saying some heavy stuff, but they're also still just humans. Is what I kind of came to understand, which is a bit of a letdown. So, I still love that music, and I think they're incredible poets, but they don't have all the answers for sure. And it might sound incredibly naive, but when I first set out on the world, I kind of expected that the poets would have all the answers. They don't have all the answers.
But I think that's what growing up is realizing that there isn't anyone that has the answers, and everybody's just kind of pulling through whatever circumstances they have as best they can. And there's not a playbook.
Well, that's why you gotta integrate all these different artists, right? Because no one poet has all the answers, but all the poets all together have all the answers. It's all in between the lines, though, right? It's all in the failings, right? You look at a poet and you look at their life, right? And then you look at their life and you compare that to what they've written about, and you can see what things they're killing it at and what things they're not. And there's a lot of just abject suffering out there too, right? Which is, I think it's healthy to realize that other people are suffering and identify with that and be like, okay, it's not just me, especially when you're a teenager, right? It's like, everything's so hard and difficult, and this girl's breaking my heart, and my parents suck. It's like, other people feel that way too, and that's comforting.
I was thinking about it more in context of actually solving problems, because like there's the emotional realm, and I think that poetry helps with the emotional realm, But I look out onto the world and I'm always trying to figure out, okay, so is it possible to create a world where there is less suffering? Is it possible to create a world that is more just? Is it possible to create a world that is more functional for more people? It's kind of a utilitarian perspective. Is it possible to accumulate massive quantities of wealth without it being inherently exploitative? And I don't think that people really have those things worked out. Like, I don't think that there's some ideology that you could stumble into that would solve those problems. It literally just seems like a machine that is running under its own weight without really, no one's at the wheel.
I mean, the best that music can do is call attention to it, which is like classic Woody Guthrie, Rage Against the Machine, stuff like that. That gets your wheels spinning, at least brings people together under the banner of, hey, there's something fucked up happening over here. We should talk about it. And you can say it's just talk, but it is the first step to action.
I don't feel like music that's popular does that anymore. Like that was the
It's come up a few times, right? Like that when folk music became popular for the first time in the 60s, which was kind of weird, like that folk music became popular. I think that was one of the times it reared its head. But there was also like a strong social activism platform. There was the Vietnam War that everybody was opposed to, that they could rally behind. And I think you saw a little bit of that in the 90s, in the Rage Against the Machine years, because with the whole, I mean, right around the 2003 Bush invasion of Iraq and all of that, there was a little bit of sentiment that could have been rallied, but yeah, there's just not like a unified counterculture at the moment.
Not only is there not a unified counterculture, I almost think that caring too much about trying to make things better is kind of cringy.
For you?
No, in the common worldview.
Well, it's not entirely clear which path you should take to make things better, first of all.
Was it ever?
No, it's not clear what the problem set is, and I think that that's different. Like, there was an obvious Vietnam War that everybody was like, this is ridiculous, what are we doing fighting people on the other side of the world that have nothing to do with America? And that was something that all of the, not all, but a huge population could rally behind. Today, what do you have? You have maybe like COVID or something, and half the people are like, that was a disaster, and the other half are like, shut up, you're ruining the world, you should take care of people. And it's this divide where there's not really a unified front. And there's a huge portion of the population that's just like, I just want to relax. I just don't, let's not talk about that.
Yeah, I just, party while the world burns. But I don't know. I think that there are really clear things to rally against, right? Like there's no animals in the woods. There's no fish in the rivers. The birds are dying. There's no insects.
Most people aren't out in the woods or in the rivers.
I think that people are aware of these problems, but there's this feeling of, well, what are we going to do about it? Like, I remember I was reading that Tullis Onstott book, The Deep Life, and he was a geologist, and he was talking about how one of the early projects that he was involved in was at Hannaford. And Hannaford is this nuclear waste storage facility. I think that it used to be a power plant, and now they just store nuclear waste there. And at some point, the Department of Energy realized that the pits were leaking.
That's right.
And everyone who was involved in the project was like, we're not actually going to do surveys to see just how badly they're leaking, because if we were to discover that it was getting into the groundwater that was then being sent to all of the communities in the Columbia River Basin, it would be a problem of a scale that the government did not have the money or the ability to fix. And so it was much easier to just be like, okay, shit's fucked up. We should try to make it not continue to be fucked up on the surface level. Like we should retrofit the waste pits,
Mhm.
but we're not actually going to look to see how this is getting distributed into the groundwater because it is a problem that we cannot deal with. And so,
Yeah, that might be the modern situation. It's just too overwhelming of a structural problem to even look at for most people.
this is why I get this feeling about money where I'm like, it's such a weird construct because why can we not fix it? Because there's no money, right? Because there's not enough money in the budget of the Department of Energy to actually be able to fix what's happening with nuclear waste leaking into groundwater. And so,
But that's kind of bullshit because you have trillions of dollars missing from the budget to the Defense Department, right?
well, the Defense Department makes a lot of money for the country.
Well, they secure the. Yeah, okay, fair. In some sense, yes, they secure the trade interests.
Directly. Like, your military prowess is what is necessary in order to be able to get the resources that you need, to have the trade relations that you need, to be able to be a force of capital in the world. And spending that money on something like cleaning up the water supply, what does that get you in the immediate term?
Materially, yeah.
You might get better human capital, right? Because the people who are no longer being poisoned by the stuff that's in their water are able to do better work and they're able to think more clearly and they're less...
Nobody's thinking like that.
Right? And so I just look at it and I'm like, God, it's so crazy because the orientation towards money is the orientation that allows all of these things to propagate because the decisions that are being made on the level of we need to do stuff that will make us more money and we can't do the stuff that's necessary to actually take care of people because foundationally that's not something that makes us money.
Yeah, it's woven into every aspect of our global civilization. I mean, even the way that retirement funds are just invested in index funds and so forth, right? It's just an algorithmic process. Yeah, it's interesting how we haven't really figured out how to decouple that monolithic value of growth. Really is what it is, just growth orientation. We haven't figured out how to couple that to humanity perfectly yet.
Well, I think that this is why there's not a central social cause. Because everyone's kind of complicit in it.
Yeah, you have to be. We're all bought into it. We all want to keep the lights on. We all need to pay rent, right?
And not only that, but if we were talking about this, like, buying stuff feels good. Or was I talking to Brenton about this? It might have been Brenton. Where it's like, she grew up in a house where what they would do for fun is they would go shopping.
I think that's pretty common.
I mean, that was kind of how my mom was too, yeah.
I mean, my friends who have the most slaving desk jobs definitely spend the most money on toys. I think it's a well-known corollary. It makes sense, you're going to work your ass off at something you don't really like doing. May as well get something out of it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It reminds me of this TV show we've been watching. With the,
Severance?
Severance, yeah. People who sever their work lives from their day lives because their work lives suck so much. Sorry, day lives, night lives.
Yeah, yeah. I just think that the Vietnam War was a really obvious thing for people to rally against because you had this thing, it was a juggernaut that was going to come for you and it was going to kill you or it was going to kill somebody that you loved. And it was really easy to be like, I don't want that. But you look at the landscape today and everything is so much less black and white. The ability to go to the store and pick up blueberries from Chile doesn't feel like you're doing something bad because you want blueberries. It's nice to be able to go and get the thing that you want and put it in your smoothies and have a great day and keep going. And the idea that you would not do that feels crazy. It feels like monk-like. It feels somehow weird to protest that level of...
And ineffective too, right?
I mean, if everybody stopped buying the blueberries, they'd just stop shipping them from Chile. I don't think that it's ineffective. I think that there's no will.
But when you talk about the damage of buying blueberries from Chile, like that goes so deep. Like that goes into the CIA takeover of South America and this whole chain of misery and wickedness, right?
Like everybody's bought into the system because they want to be able to buy blueberries. And it seems like a harmless thing to do to buy blueberries. But then when you start to really look at the way that it's connected into the hegemony of the United States and the things that it's done in order to be able to secure those trade relationships in order to feed its people, then it starts to get really dark really quickly.
I think people live with heavy guilt about that, honestly.
You think they actually know that they're feeling guilty about it?
I mean, on some level, I think so, right? I think there's a deep shaming for sure in the culture right now. I think there's this tendency, this is tied into the tendency to treat humans like a plague on the earth a little bit, and the corporate greenwashing movement and so forth. I think there is this sense of guilt of being in the modern age that we didn't experience when I was a kid. And I think a lot of the alt-right reactionary stuff is in response to that guilt and trying to throw it off, you know? And they try to make it about gender or about traditional values or something, but it's really just this sense of unease of, look, ever since the beginning of civilization, as far as I can see, countries have been fighting over trade routes, and the countries that are able to secure those trade routes prosper, and the people are more or less not starving. Like, it's just, they're more or less happy, they're not starving. And that's good for those people, but it's also bad for the people they displaced. And this has been the dog-eat-dog world since ever, pretty much. You know, even people, there's, of course, the ridiculous myth of the Native American that's peaceful and everything, but these were warring tribes with, you know, we're all territorial apes is what it is at the end of the day. And so I don't think that you can shake that off. And the United States has secured a great deal of comfort for all of us. And it's done so by being the strongest territorial ape on the scene, for better or for worse. And I just don't know that you're going to squeeze the territorial ape out of the territorial ape. Like, what does the future look like that's not territorial apes? It has to be a full evolution of human consciousness. And how does that happen?
And that, I think, is why people can't really organize themselves into cohesive groups of resistance that have unified visions in their art and in their activism and everything else. Because you look at it and you're like, what, people just have to be better?
Yeah.
People just have to want less. People just want to have to be able to control their appetites to a degree where they don't just consume endlessly.
It also only takes one apple to spoil the barrel, right? Like, you deal with a really bad person and you're quickly confronted with the fact that your pie in the sky idealization of everybody just leveling up their consciousness is not going to happen.
Not only that, but I feel like there's also a transference of bad behavior. Like, we watched this unbelievably unpleasant discussion between Professor Dave and James Tour last night, where they basically, it was a debate, quote unquote, but I think that we both kind of came down to the fact that what they really wanted to do was cage fight. But
my theory is that it would have been a much better cage fight than a debate.
It was basically a cage fight just with words. It was just mudslinging and screaming at each other, and it was embarrassing for both of them. But I felt my entire mindset get altered and affected by listening to them do that. Because it was like, this is how people are. This is how I am. And I kind of saw it in you too. Like, we had that kind of the eruption of conflict immediately afterwards. And I was able to zoom out enough to be able to realize that what we were doing is we were manifesting the patterns that we had just been watching for the last hour. And I noticed this too when I go home and I see family or something. like my family was always just very.
Were you the Professor Dave or was I the Professor Dave in the conflict?
They were both awful. Like I think that there was.
I think I was the Professor Dave. I'm sad to say. Honestly, like Dave, like kept his cool. He was just a big asshole. Is the thing. He was just really mean and
sneery.
It was just horrible. But Dr. Tour was just yelling over top of him, and I feel bad that we even brought this up now.
Well,
We're actually going to interview Dr. Tour later today.
That's why he won't be able to hear this before we interview.
I wish we could interview not Dr. Dave.
Professor Dave.
Professor, Master Dave.
Maybe questionable professor. Unclear if Dave is actually a professor. But the thing that I'm trying to say is that there is this attitude where, okay, so you can take the moral high ground and you can do the right thing, but the minute that you interact with somebody that is behaving badly, there is this release that happens inside of a person's psychology where they're like, okay, no holds barred, I get to be bad too. And you saw this because the way that the conversation started with Tour and Farina was the fact that Tour brought him a gift. He brought him this graphene etching that he had done of his face, and there was some text on it or something like that. And
it was a really good faith gesture.
It was classy. It was like old world classy, right? You show up to a debate, you bring a gift, you set yourself, you shake hands, and then you duel. But Farina was basically just slinging mud, right? He came right out of the gate.
So sad. Yeah, he didn't even come out about the science. The bulk of his argument was that Tour was a bad person, which is just such a shitty stance in a debate that's in a scientific hall, in a scientific venue with scientific moderators, to just come out talking shit about somebody's person.
And what you could see is that Tour couldn't control the emotions that it evoked in him. And everything went off the rails because he tried for a little bit to maintain equanimity, but it was just, there was so much mudslinging that he at some point was like, you know what? No. This is what we do.
Well, Dave's really smart and mean.
Yeah.
Like that's a brutal combination. Somebody who's really articulate and really intelligent and really mean. It's like they can figure out. That's the psychopath, basically. That's the brilliant psychopath that people like to watch on Netflix. That's the person who can figure out how to make the pain the most maximized possible version of itself, because they see into you with their intelligent little eyes, and they can dig out what hurts you the most and apply that, that put you to the tool, basically.
And I noticed that in myself, where when I'm by myself or I'm in a really controlled setting, I can regulate my interactions with people, I can step away from conflict, I can de-escalate things, but I go see family and it's just all of these old reptile brain patterns that suddenly just explode. And I'm like brought into the past where there is a way that you deal with these things, and it's not a high-minded, calm discourse. It's as emotional as anything could possibly get. And so it's really easy to get sucked into that because you can have all of these amazing ideals for how you should be, but then you're confronted with someone who isn't acting according to those rules. And then you immediately get into a position where you're like, okay, well, the only way that I can prevail, or the only way that I can survive, is by breaking my own rules. And it's always so.
And there's an argument against that, right? A rational argument. Gandhi is a great example. Right? The idea of extreme nonviolence, the idea of, well, I'm going to let Professor Dave just sit here and slander me, and I'm not going to engage with it. And I'm going to be like, okay, what do you have to say about the science? Let's talk about the science. This isn't about me. If you want to attack me as a person, let's schedule a cage fight 6 months from now. I'll train, you train, and we'll just bash each other's faces. And we'll bash each other's faces in, because that's a much more productive way to handle a dispute about my person. But like sitting here, or sue me, or let's go to court or whatever, But if you want to just engage with that in conversation, it's pointless. The only thing Dr. Tour could have done is just completely ignored the personal attacks and just, even emotionally, I mean, literally, his existence, his soul had to ignore it and just stick to the science. Like, hey, you haven't addressed the point that I've made here scientifically. Because Dave didn't do a good job of addressing his points.
No, he just showed a bunch of abstracts.
Right. And he didn't actually know the details of it. And so if Tour would have been like, no, just held him to it. No, you have to explain how this equation is completed. You can't just point at a bunch of papers. You need to actually explain to me and show me it in the data where it is. And no matter what the other guy says, he's just going to sink his own ship eventually by not answering the questions, essentially. I think that's the only thing he could have done, but it's really hard with a psychopath.
I mean, you can't deal with someone who's not engaged in good faith.
That's the other thing.
Right. I mean, and I think that's, you can use the word psychopath or you can just use bad faith, and I think that they're gradients of the same thing. But somebody who engages not because they're interested in pushing.
Well, it's kind of psychopathic to show up to a civilized, institutional, structured event. It's a conversation that's supposed to have structure. The point of having a civilized debate is that people take turns speaking, things like this, right? So it's a little psychopathic to show up to something that clearly has a structure like this and then to disregard it. I mean, the first rule of debate, and anybody who's been in a high school debating club, is you don't attack people's person, right? And you don't interrupt people when they're talking. Like, there's some basic ground rules that you don't, I mean, Dave's smart enough to know these are the ground rules. So showing up to an event like that and then just behaving like a wild monkey is a little bit psychopathic, in my opinion.
Unless the goal was to just drum up publicity.
Yeah, I'm sure it was.
Right, because I mean, they both have YouTube channels, and Tour obviously has his own academic career, but a huge part of that event was just basically a pay-per-view fight.
Yeah, it wasn't even a good fight.
It's just messy.
I don't know. I've really been thinking a lot lately about this idea that in science, in any situation, you know, even if we completely disagree about the science, our goal is us versus the problem, ultimately. It can't be me versus you. So when I go and talk to somebody who disagrees or has some objection or is even attacking me personally in some scientific context, I'm really trying to remind myself that it's me and this person versus the problem, and just constantly reorienting myself to that way of thinking about it.
I mean, it's difficult in science, right? Because you ran across this when you guys were publishing this spore paper that we've been meaning to talk about, which is that you find yourself not being able to say certain things because the environment is not conducive to that kind of speculation. And so it's hard in the sciences because what you want is you want to be able to show up to a place and you want to be able to say, look, this is the problem, and we're going to work together on figuring out a way how to solve this. And in process of doing that, we're going to put forward ideas on the table that might not be the right ideas, but are ways of looking at the data that we have that might be illuminating. And there's this tendency to shut that down because our evidentiary rules for science are so strict right now that if you are looking at, let's say, the physical state of water in spores, it can feel really dangerous to then come out and say something biological about that. Because the entire biology community, where there are people that have been spending 30 years trying to figure out the biological question that you might have figured out the answer to, and they're going to expect you to come at it from their way of looking at it, which is, you know, mutagenesis and all these different strains and looking at different species and blah, 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 blah. But really what you just want to be able to say is like, hey, we found this thing, and I think that it might have implications.
Yeah, but in that case, it's exactly like you're coming from the outside. I remember, because I went and gave this talk in London to a bunch of spore biologists, and they enjoyed the talk, and I had really good discussion with everybody afterwards, but they kind of treated it was very charitable, but they very much treated it as if like, oh, that's interesting. But it was so foreign to the way that they were approaching the problem of spore germination that they couldn't really comment on it You know what I mean? Like, it's a physical argument for spore germination is the punchline. It's based on the physics of the structured water inside of the spore. And it was almost just like, oh, that's nice. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And a few people got it and were like, wow, this is crazy, actually. But, you know, one of those people died, for instance. You know,
Unfortunate.
it's like, it's a whole insular community. And I think that's the same thing that Pierre runs into with his astrophysical ideas, is that he's coming from the outside. His background, although extremely important because it's all about spectroscopy, isn't specifically in solar physics. And so all the people with their whole fixed action pattern of how to process astrophysics are coming to the problem from a completely different angle. And if you show up and you're like from a other world looking at the same problem, people at best are going to be like, all right. But it's not, then they're going to go back to attacking the problem from their traditional angle.
I think that we should clarify what we're talking about right now, which is that you finally published your grad school work 10 years on in Nature, which was a huge accomplishment. Very, very proud of you.
Oh,
I think that it's really cool, you know, just the fact that you stuck through it, that you were such a key, because a lot of times when people leave labs, they don't get their name on the publication anymore. Or if they do, it's like, you know, some third, fourth name, because they don't stick with it, they don't answer the emails, they're kind of like interested in disengaging. But I think that you, like always, persisted. And so,
I mean, I was really fortunate to have a great relationship with my mentor. It's just rare for grad students.
You made that happen. I think that you're very careful about your relationships, and I think that that was not an accident.
I don't know. He's a really cool dude, for sure. Shout out Oscar Sahin.
But what was crazy is that you and I have talked about this research a lot. And whenever we talked about it, we were always talking about it from the biological standpoint, because we were both in a biology PhD program, and you were studying the biological consequences of it kind of in parallel to the physical reality that was inside the spore. And then I read the paper, which is just called Hydration Solids, which is like very simple, nothing biological. And I was shocked because the paper didn't have any of the biology in it. Didn't have any biological speculation in it.
Yeah, it was kind of a bummer.
And so I wonder why that is.
Well, I did want to take a minute to share the biological implications with the world on this podcast, you know, assuming our tiny little world, but I do want to at least go over that because it got buried. Actually, I'll probably just put a link to my dissertation down here because I lay it all out there. And I think that the final figure, if you want to just flip to the end of the dissertation, explains the biological importance of the finding.
In true scientific fashion, burying the lead till the final figure. Unbelievable.
Well, it's one of those things, like you said, where it's not proven, right? It's a hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right. And hypothesis is a really important concept that's terribly misunderstood in science, in my opinion. But Descartes defined it as a supposition that, if true, but not necessarily asserted as true, would be sufficient to prove the theory.
Wait, hold on. I don't understand that. Not necessarily asserted as true?
Yeah. So a supposition that, if true, though not necessarily asserted as true, would be sufficient to prove the theory of the phenomenon.
So not necessarily asserted as true means that nobody's actually looked yet.
Yeah, you either can't tell because you don't have the technological ability, or you haven't figured out the experiment, or you don't have the data. It's like, hey, if this was the case, then this theory would make sense. And so in our case, the theory is that the spore, well, let's tell everybody what a spore is. I mean, you probably know, but bacterial spores are like these seed-like protected phase of these bacterial organisms where they go into something like a hibernation, and they can go to sleep for perhaps millions of years and then become reanimated. And nobody's been able to necessarily identify how they become reanimated after all of these years of sleep. There are nutrients that do it, there are salts that do it, you can do it with high pressures, high temperatures, but they can't find this traditional ligand receptor interaction. They know that there's molecules that particular portions of the inner membrane are sensitive to, but they're not directly coupled to the channels that allow for the reanimation of the spore. And so people have been looking for years and years and years. And anyways,
Hold on, let me
let me just put it in one sentence. So what we're proposing is that instead of there being an actual receptor ligand interaction, the structure of the water is being perturbed by these chemicals. This water is bearing incredible tension in the spore, and when it's disturbed by these nutrient signals, that leads to the disintegration of the spore's architecture, such that these different channels can raft together inside of the inner membrane. It regains some fluidity, and the thing can start to reanimate because the genetic material gets hydrated again.
So basically, the problem in spore biology has for 50 years been the fact that there are these known germinants, right? So you have substances that you can add to a solution that contains spores, and very reliably, those substances will cause the spores to return to what's called a vegetative state, where the bacteria are actually functional, they're swimming around, they're doing stuff. And the thing is that in biology, the paradigm for how stuff happens is really receptor ligand based, where you have to have a receptor that grabs a hold of some molecule, and then the receptor either has to actually come into the cell and move somewhere and do something, or it can activate a signaling cascade where there is a series of things that happen which inevitably impinge upon the DNA, and then there's some change in gene expression, and then you get your action.
It's like a lock and key situation, right? It's like you open the door by putting the key in the lock, and the key is some chemical, the lock is some receptor, and then the door is usually some ion channel or something that amplifies the response.
And so the problem with spore biology is that inside of a spore, the contents, the genetic information is really crystallized, because there's this dehydration process that happens where I think that it's a magnesium ion that because I did spore biology for like a hot second at the beginning of my rotation. And so I remember looking into this, and basically there's a dehydration process that occurs where everything that's inside of the spore turns solid. It basically is the solid phase crystal, which is why spores can live for so long, because there's not...
It's a calcium acid, but yeah.
I thought it was magnesium.
It's like calcium dipichlorate or something like that, which is the chelating agent that sops up all of these. There's more to it, though. There's physical reasons for how it dehydrates, too, which is part of the entire theory and hypothesis.
Right. So, but the problem with spore biology has always been that you can show that germinants bind these receptors, right? So in a test tube...
Quote unquote receptors, right? Receptors. If you take them out, behaviors become modified. It's harder to germinate them and so forth, right?
The research that you guys were doing in the lab was based first and foremost upon the strange physical properties of spores, right? So you were coming at it from a physical perspective. And the biological stuff was kind of tacked on as necessity for your PhD, because you were in a biology department.
Yeah, I basically joined a physics engineering lab, but somehow I had to convince my committee to give me a biology PhD.
And so
biophysics, whatever.
And so you started thinking about the biological question of it, but really what you guys were doing is you were looking at the physical process by which the spore is able to do this dehydration, rehydration work, because as you dehydrate the spore, it shrinks. As you rehydrate it, it expands, and it has a really strong material that it's made out of, where you can actually use those spores when arranged properly to do work. And so you were making
these... It's kind of like if you can imagine, like you had like a table that's made out of plastic that's about the same stiffness as a spore, but imagine that you just put some steam on it and the table expanded to, you know, some percentage, some large, like it swelled up by like 5 or 10%, and you could lift a car with it, right? That's kind of what the spore is. So this ability to rehydrate, and we don't just mean dunking it in water. I mean, just humidity gradients can do incredible work, actually. It has energy density on par with some of the best materials out there that are, actuators.
And so at the beginning, you guys were building these little machines. I remember somebody built this like hydration Ferris wheel, and the video for this is up on YouTube somewhere, where Science Shilo shows up with his white lab coat.
Put a note. We'll put it in the show, or we'll put it in the description. It's kind of a cool video. I'm proud because I did the music for it.
Lab coat, Shilo. And so you were there was the Ferris wheel, there was also these like hydration power generating machines where like you could have this vessel full of water and then you put the actuator machine on top of it and it would be able to open and close these shutters. You showed that you could generate enough power to like light
with just water, by the way. So as long as there's water in these machines, they will self-cycle and generate electricity perpetually, and it's on the amount of energy or power that you're outputting is on par with solar, let's say, but it's not intermittent, right? Because you can run these things as long as there's water in the chamber. You can let some of it out and have this evaporation. You get this humidity gradient, which is what's necessary to do the work.
And so it was very, very physical and very intriguing because it was possible to imagine a future where, reservoirs had these spore actuator machines on top of them and were generating power in places where there's a lot of evaporation. And so it was like very cool idea. That seems like it kind of collapsed at some point though.
Yeah, I mean, what happened was we got really excited about this idea. We published some papers in Nature Communications, Nature Nanotech about this. And people were excited. They thought it was cool. We actually got written up in a bunch of different pop magazines, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, I don't remember, a bunch of places. People, I think Der Spiegel did a pretty cool piece where they made a render, like an AI render of what one of these power plants would look like. So the guys, Ozgur and Hamdi and Shi, took it on the road. They went out to the West Coast to visit these different power companies, and they were trying to basically sell them on the idea. And I think it was really heartbreaking because the power companies were basically just like, yo, we like what we're doing. We have hydroelectric power. We dam these rivers. We burn this coal. It's cool. We're good. And they have all, in order to implement the technology that we developed, you need to basically cover reservoirs with this material. And people were not hot on that at all. Even though it's a great idea because they already cover all these California reservoirs, like these little balls, right? Veritasium has a video about this.
I think there's one reservoir.
Okay, well, it's like an idea people like, right? But, all of the power companies were in the way of the politicians. The people want to be able to boat on the reservoirs. They're in the way. So it's like people, I think it was really heartbreaking to the team. I really can't speak to their emotions on it, but it seems like it was a big letdown. Fortunately, I was not really working too much on that engineering project. I did do a little bit for them. I did some minor things, did some SEM for their material science and stuff. But yeah, I was working on just a basic physics question. What the hell is going on inside of these spores that allows for this incredible power output? How do they do this?
And as a consequence of that, you eventually realize that there was probably some larger biological significance of the form, right? So form follows function, function follows form. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about the weird stuff that you guys found inside of the bacterial spore and how you kind of were able to connect it to this question of germination.
Yeah, I think that without getting too far in the weeds, technically, the primary finding was that the water inside of the spore was extraordinarily viscous, on the order of ice, essentially. And, ice is interesting. Okay, so there's ice inside the spores. Well, it's not quite like ice because the water can actually move in and out of the spores, right? So I developed this method to essentially take an AFM cantilever, which is this tiny little micron-sized platform, that oscillates, it can bend. And you cover the back of it in spores, and then as you cycle the humidity, you can see the cantilever bends in response to the spores changing size on the back of it. Shine a laser off the back, you can amplify that effect, and you can make very precise measurements. And I developed this way of housing the AFM in this temperature-controlled environment with humidity control and all of this, and was able to essentially make measurements of how the water went in and out of the spores. And from looking at a comparison of the diffusivity of that water, the time constant, how long it takes the water to go in and out, gives you an idea of the diffusion. Diffusion can be compared to the stiffness of the spores to give you a measure of the viscosity of the material. And what we find essentially is that this water is both fluid but also has extraordinarily slow motion. Totally unexpected. And so the amazing thing about this is that the spore's water is under incredible tension, hundreds of megapascals of tension. And it's just a water structure. And so we started thinking about that from a biological standpoint, and we looked at the different things that reanimate spores: salt, pressure. Those are the same things that you would use in a winter storm in Ohio, where I grew up, to melt the roads, right? You salt the roads, or you go ice skating on a pond by putting pressure on it, and it melts the ice. We thought, okay, well, what if that's what's happening in terms of reanimating these creatures? And it's also really tantalizing because you're looking for a really primitive mechanism. These are some of the oldest organisms that we know of in terms of the phylogenetic ancestry.
Like their ancestry is really deeply rooted. They themselves are not particular. I mean, the Bacillus subtilis, or whatever you were using, is not necessarily ancient, but the family of firmicutes is really old.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, the particular organisms aren't that old or anything.
But the firmicutes are some of the only bacteria that generate spores, I think. And the firmicute family is really, really, really ancient.
Right. And spores are at the heart of panspermia ideas, right? Because NASA did a bunch of tests with spores where they took them out into space and they exposed them to radiation, solar wind. They exposed them to the vacuum of space, and they were able to bring them back to Earth and reanimate them. And so there's a couple NASA bulletins where they're like, hey, look, there's inclusions inside of these meteorites that absolutely could house bacterial spores. They probably could survive the vacuum of space and all of the terrible insults of space. I mean, and that's a whole nother question. How the hell do they do that? How do they protect their genetic material? And of course, we think that the water itself and the resonant structure of the water is important, especially in a lot of this radiation and in pressure protection, right? Because they're just so buckled down, right? All that DNA is literally not moving. Mm-hmm. So it remains a hypothesis, is really, at the end of the day, it remains a hypothesis. And, every once in a while, every couple of years since then, I'll see a paper that claims to have solved the spore mystery. These pop sci headlines are always so outrageous, like, we've achieved fusion for the first time, like for the 20th time in a row, And in this case, it's like, we've found the mechanism. But when you really start to push on the data and look at what's going on, it's not so clear. They've definitely found proteins that are important. They found how once the germination event occurs, how the inner membrane rearranges itself so as that the genetic material can get rehydrated, right? And there's a lot of details being flushed out there, a lot of information. But as far as I can see, that actual transduction moment is still lacking. And I maintain that the hypothesis of the structured water itself being the transducer of information still remains on the table. But some diligent grad student's going to have to come along and prove that out, because it certainly has not been proved by us.
I mean, that's the difficult thing about looking at biological systems like this, right? Where the idea that there is a structure that is the controlling gate, as opposed to there being some kind of protein-based gate is far beyond the way that biology usually looks at stuff. And so the way that I always interpreted the spore
Far beyond. It's like complete left field.
I mean, Jerry Pollack works on it, but I think that Jerry Pollack has been fighting an uphill battle for many, many years to get people to really start to look at easy water and the role of water inside of biological systems as more than just a hydration fluid.
Yeah, he's not he doesn't have a lot of high-end collaborators too. I don't want to pick on this guy. I know Oscar has like huge problems with him because he makes assertions that aren't actually backed up. Like he doesn't totally understand the water physics. For instance, those like the Debye length of these interactions only persists for a few layers outside of the surface. And so he makes these wild claims about it persisting at these outrageous lengths, which nobody has really got on board with. It contradicts a lot of the basic physics. And, you know, there are arguments to be made. Cells are not empty spaces, right? They're completely webbed with actin filaments, and there are a lot of surfaces going on. And so I think a case could be made, but there's something about the way that he's gone about it that really rubs people working in the upper institutions on structures of water, hydration layers, things like this. It rubs them the wrong way.
Well, there's a certain style in which you have to make scientific claims. And this is why you didn't end up including the biological stuff in the paper, because getting published at one of these high-end journals, everything has to be buttoned up so carefully and presented in such a careful way that okay, so there's a couple of things here, because on one hand, I don't know what more you would have to show in order to be able to make the statement that you think that this is biologically significant for germination. Like, I'm really shocked that that's not in the paper.
Well, it's a hypothesis. Like, publishing hypotheses has gone out of fashion because I found going back into the 1960s in some of these top journals, Science, Nature, people published hypotheses regularly. And you don't see that. People just write a short letter. Hey, I think this is how this works. It seems like if this is true, it might solve this problem. But nowadays, people expect you to actually show in some model system, demonstrate how that is the case, and how if you remove this mechanism, it's not possible anymore, and so forth.
I don't know. I know that that's the prevailing wisdom, and it's stylistically kind of out of fashion, but I feel like the thing that you showed, which is the fact that there's this weird structure of water inside the spore cortex that changes in the presence of germinants, is enough to be able to say that that probably has to do with germination. And I'm just shocked that it didn't, even a sentence of it, right? Because you don't have to make a claim where you just plant a flag and you're like, this is the answer, we have solved it forevermore. But just to be able to say that, like, hey, we think that this might be important for this kind of work, and any kind of study of germination should probably try to look at this. I'm just shocked that it wasn't in there at all.
I mean, you can check out the back half of my dissertation, like, if anybody wants to, because, like, all we're able to show is that the spore loses its stiffness and integrity when you add these germinants, but it's hard to say chicken or egg, right? It's like, as the spore biologists are hoping they're going to find this signal transduction event chemically inside, like something happens in the inner membrane where it signals to the other part, how can you say that that's not what's happening, right? It's a very difficult claim to make with any certainty because, yeah, this integrity of the spore falls apart. Everybody knows that already, right?
I think that it would have to be timelines where you and mutants, right? So
mutants, exactly. So you'd have to find a mutant that didn't have the spore can't stay a spore without the structural integrity is the problem. Like, the water structure is important. It gains this structured water when it dehydrates in the first place. It tensions the spore, and by tensioning the cortex around that genetic material, it squeezes all the water out of it. Mm-hmm. So you can't get a spore if you don't have the structured water in the first place. So it'd be difficult to have a mutant that didn't have the structured water that you could say wasn't able to be reanimated.
Well, no, it wouldn't be the structured water that was missing. It would be, okay, so the model is that you have a receptor-ligand interaction that's doing something to cause germination, right? So ideally you would mess with that receptor.
But they have done all of that. They know that that's why they call them receptors, is because if they take them out, germination gets messed up in some way.
Okay. And so the next level would be time dynamics, which is that, like, okay, so if you have information about how long it takes for something to diffuse through the spore, at what point does germination begin? Is it directly in the amount of time that it takes for the salt to diffuse to that inner membrane? Or is it time to diffuse to the inner membrane plus some? Because plus some suggests signal transduction.
The signal transduction is instantaneous almost inside of a biological, like inside the electron transport chain or something. It's very fast.
But this isn't an electron transport chain sort of
But
thing.
it would be an electron situation, right? It would be a chemical signaling. Something would electrostatically be interacting at the inner membrane according to the traditional model, which would be very, very fast. I mean, I agree with you that a really smart look at the time dynamics might give you some insight, but it would be really hard to make the claim that what is happening wasn't a chemical interaction that we just couldn't find, the dark matter interaction of the spore, and say, no, the water itself fell apart. I think honestly, if you did some NMR, like we dreamed about maybe doing some NMR studies where we could see the water in one state and see it disintegrate before the spore reanimated. If we could see that fall apart first, even by a few microseconds before the inner membrane rafted together or something, or even or even before the chemicals reach that inner membrane, right? Because that'd be the real coup, is that the cortex is falling apart before the inner membrane falls apart.
That's what I'm trying to say, is that, like, there has to be some ability to look at the cortex and to see that the cortex is falling apart because of the addition of these salts before the salts have time to reach the membrane. Because if it is already falling apart as they're diffusing through it, you'd be able to see a change in stiffness that begins before the salt could have diffused to the inner membrane.
Right, so you need like a fluorescent readout of when it binds to these quote-unquote receptors, and you need a readout of the water at the same time, the state that the water is in. And you need to be able to show that the state of the water by NMR or something is changed before the fluorescent binding of these receptors.
Maybe, but I'm also thinking about just like with AFM, because what you're doing is you can look at the physical structure of the cortex, and you can also see the image of the spore hatching.
It's not so clear cut. You need to really see that inner membrane bound by those molecules after the structure disintegrates.
Why is it that you can't say that, okay, it takes it X amount of time to diffuse through the spore when the cortex is still
like there hasn't been enough
sound?
time, like the spore has lost stiffness before there's been enough time for it to diffuse to the inner membrane.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good experiment. I mean, you'd have to, again, fluorescently label from the time of addition. I mean, this has actually probably been done, how long it takes. I know for a fact there's time curves of how long it takes for these receptors to be bound. And you'd have to be able to essentially show that the spore loses stiffness before that happens. But I think in order to publish that in Nature or Cell or something, you'd have to do them at the same time. You'd have to literally you'd build an apparatus that could do both, give you that fluorescent readout, and also give you the stiffness measurement, and be able to have them on the same clock in the same experiment and show that it happened. I think it'd be a cool experiment for a grad student.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem with a lot of biology, is the fact that the questions that people are asking are so difficult to tease apart. Because most of the work that we do is on stuff that you can't actually look at in real time in a direct way.
And that's what I think, that's what these big journals are all about, is these really complex, difficult, expensive experiments, right? Like I wanted to mention that this paper was rejected so many freaking times. We had to bring an entirely new grad student on to do an entirely new set of experiments to say something that was really difficult to say about this material, right? Because all of my work was based on poroelastic theory, which is a very well established way of looking at these diffusion kinetics with respect to viscosity and everything that I've been talking about. And we had to literally come up with a new theory of that material, which we called the hydration solid. And in order to do that, we had to move past poroelastic theory and this this physics student came on, Steve, shout out to Steve Harrelson, who's my co-first author on this paper. And Steve came at it from a completely different angle and was looking at different oscillation mechanics with respect to how you can probe this water and say something special about it that isn't just poroelastic theory. Because us saying, wow, this is an incredible phase of water that's happening here wasn't enough. We had to actually come up with a whole new mathematical framework for describing that new phase of water. It's not really a phase, I shouldn't say that, but this new, it kind of is a phase. But this new water structure, right? We needed a new theory for that, and we called it, well, they called it, Steve and Osger called it the hydration solid. So I think that, you know, people have come up to me since then and been like, hey, how do I publish a paper in Nature? And I'm like, you need $500,000 for building an incredible experiment that nobody else has the patience or money to pull off. Like, that's a huge part of it. So, for better or for worse, probably for worse, but that's the thing about these high-end journals, right? It's not enough to just have a good idea. It's not enough to even, right? I think this is what people tend to not understand about institutional science in general, about science that's valued by civilization. It's not just that it was a good idea. It's like, it was a good idea that somebody just developed the living shit out of, right? They really attacked it from all these different technological angles. They really tear it apart. They really answer every little painful question someone could come up with about it. That's what people are rewarded for with these high-end publications with prizes and things like that. It's not just for having a cool idea.
I mean, I think that you could probably address this by having some portion of the journal be devoted to cool ideas.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
Right, because in a pollination project sense, you have a journal where people are publishing super detailed, very rigorous experimental work, but you also should have a place inside that same journal where people are able to be like, hey, this hasn't been shown yet, but if true, and it seems plausible that it could be true, would explain this and this. And then, because that's the grounds by which somebody who's running a lab could look at a paper like that and be like, I can test that.
Yeah.
And then you pollinate the relationship between these people through that, and then you're able to actually do way cooler stuff, because you're not just jockeying for the publication of these really complex papers that are indecipherable to other disciplines in many ways, right? Like, the people who do the paper understand it really, really well. The people who are in poroelastic theory understand it really, really well. A biologist that reads that paper is not going to be able to take anything away from it.
Yeah, that's the sad part to me, and that's why I wanted to talk about it on this podcast, but I'll probably keep talking about it because I think it is. The thing is, like, if you were able to prove what I'm saying, absolutely Nobel Prize territory. But you'd have, and what I mean by prove is demonstrate it with multiple methods, like I said, make a compelling case that nothing else could be resulting in the germination other than disturbing this water structure. But it's not enough to just have the idea. Like, it's not really worth anything almost.
And I hate to burst your bubble, but I think that it's not enough to just show that it happens in spores. You'd have to then show that it is a vital process across all domains of life in order for it to be Nobel Prize territory.
You have to have a good case for that.
Like, spore biology is probably not going to win a Nobel Prize, but if you say that the thing that we found in spores is also in humans and pigs and cats and trees and is playing a vital role in all of these different ways, then that's probably...
Absolutely.
Because it has to be transformative to the entire field. And I think that if you just transform spore biology, people are just kind of like, it's cool.
Yeah, if you could build an entire empire, like a laboratory empire, where you understood that to be true, first of all, and you could show it in multiple systems, and you could show that it was important maybe in cell signaling in general, in the body, in cancer biology. I mean, this would be... Woo.
But there's not really materials. There's not really materials like spore cortex inside the body.
Well, that we know of, right?
That we know of. And so then, like, and that's another thing, which is that we know Not that
we do suspect that the hydration solid plays a role in plant matter for sure. There's incredible tensions operating in seed dispersal and the opening of blossoms and things like that, right?
the Nobel Prize is in medicine, though, Delaney.
Yeah, forgot about that. Yeah, there isn't even one for biology, right?
Yeah, so you'd really have to be able to find a way that is transformative for medicine.
Yeah, yeah.
And that seems really, really far away, where there's not even an approximate frame for seeing something like this in the human body, because it's just such an anomalous material. And maybe we do, maybe because biophysics is still, I feel like, kind of a nascent field.
Definitely.
Because it's a really hard thing to do, right? You have to use these atomic force microscopes. You have to use these like really complex patterned surfaces. I remember Mike Sheets's lab was doing a lot of biophysics, and they were doing all of theirs on those etched pillars where they would grow cells, and they would look to see how they were pulling on the different pillars in order to be able to move and things like that. And that was just always it seemed like such a crazy difficult kind of science, because you have to have this entire infrastructure on top of it to produce the platform for you to even be able to ask the questions.
And there's a lot of physics expertise that needs to be established, right? In order to wield these tools, you have to, I mean, how many hours are there in a lifetime, right? To become good enough at the physics and the mechanics to develop the systems, how much time do you really have for biology? And how much can the biologists really spare for believing in your physical methods because they don't understand them, because they've been busy with biological problems? And so it's like these two disconnected arms are having a really hard time talking to each other.
There's also the fact that people don't really try to talk to each other that much. Like, physicists don't try to talk to biologists, and biologists don't really try to talk to physicists. There's occasionally people that you'll come through that are collaborators, people that are, like Osger, people who are kind of in both realms, but it's exceedingly rare, because the art of understanding something complicated and then being able to explain it to somebody in a way that they can take it and apply it in their own way of thinking is almost a dark art.
That's what I'm saying about this. My bizarre experience speaking at that conference in London. This is like, okay, you might be right, but what do we do with that? We don't have any
of the tools that let us even begin to touch it.
Yeah, we make mutants, right? But the mutants aren't going to solve this problem.
Mutants in collaboration with a laboratory that's using something like AFM would solve the problem.
I think that it needs to be entirely physically interrogated with these fluorescent markers and stuff. That's what I'm saying. That I don't think the mutant angle, I don't think their toolkit is capable of addressing this issue. Even if they think it's a cool idea, they're just like, well, they don't have any of the toolkit necessary to do those physical experiments.
So mutants would be useful if you could design a mutant that bound the salt more slowly. So if you change the binding kinetics at the binding pocket, where the salt would get there.
There's no salt binding pocket
in the SPOVDs or whatever.
No, I mean, these things are responding to specific amino acids and so forth, but there's never been that receptor binding interaction shown. It's just that if you take out, say, this particular protein in the inner membrane, then the amino acid doesn't have the effect that it used to. The germination doesn't proceed as expected. It's not like they found that these receptors bind, that they shouldn't be called receptors. It's a terrible, terrible abuse of that word. They're not receptors. They don't bind anything.
So like if you put them in a test tube and you add the stuff to them, they won't bind it? So what's the fluorescence experiment that you're talking about?
Somehow getting a readout of when they touch that inner membrane, right? If you could somehow see that you could label, maybe not fluorescently, but radioactively, or somehow label these germinants, these amino acids. Salts are important, by the way, in this mixture, but you somehow see when these things reach the inner membrane. Because if the disturbance of the structure of the spore happens before they reach the inner membrane, then you know that those things for sure aren't receptors. They might be important in what happens downstream of the disintegration of the cortex, but they can't be receptors anymore. You can't keep calling them that.
Interesting. I don't remember enough of my spore biology to be able to contradict you on this.
I feel pretty safe in these assertions. I mean, there is one paper by this dude, we'll leave him nameless. God, I hope he doesn't hear this podcast. Who claimed that he saw this kinase signaling reaction. One paper, and it was about 20 years ago. I think he did it for his dissertation, and nobody's reproduced it. And I should just stop talking now.
I mean, it's hard. I think the bottom line is that it's really hard. And something that I think we want to do with DemystifySci is to be the place where ideas can be laid out, and not in the way of, I have done this research and I know this to be true and it is done, finished, Nobel Prize, here I come, but more from the standpoint of, hey, if true, this would explain this, 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 and this. And someone who is interested in the experimental side can then come along, pick that idea up, and apply it.
Yep.
But there's not really a place where you can play like that with ideas, and that's what I think we really want to do with DemystifySci in the long run.
It's really valuable from the negative perspective too, which is that your hypothesis can't possibly be true. There's no mechanism available for your hypothesis to be true.
Elaborate on that.
Well, I'm just saying the method that we're advocating here, which resurrects the hypothesis as a valid form of interrogating nature, can also be applied to existing theories by which the hypothesis they assume cannot possibly be true. I'm thinking of something like the idea that a gaseous plasma generates a black body spectrum. It cannot possibly be true because it has no mechanism in common with black body radiation's spectra, which has a mechanism that has to do with the way that those atoms are producing the light that they're producing. And so if your assertion is that for whatever theory you have a theory of the sun, for instance, and it's dependent upon something that's impossible happening, then that hypothesis gets thrown in the waste bin. So you can use it on both sides, right? It's a very valuable tool in the positive, positing what's going to happen, but it's also valuable in the negative of negating something, an assertion that's made, because there's no mechanism available for that hypothesis to be true.
Yeah. I mean, there's much work to be done. And I think that that's why I'm really excited about this conference that we're planning on April, 6th and 7th in Austin next year. Because we're getting people together to come see the eclipse, but also we're going to have like a little science meeting.
Yeah. DemystifySci first conference, kicking off our world tour.
North American tour. North American world.
It's like baseball.
Yeah. So I think that it's really, really important to get people together to talk about ideas. There's somebody on Twitter that I came across was organizing these events in New York City where people would come together. They would have a potluck, and then everybody would do a 5 or 10 minute presentation about the stuff that they're working on. Whether that is figuring out the internal structure of DARPA or building a new large language model or whatever else. And it's like, that's the kind of environment that I think is really fruitful for people, and it gives them a feeling that they're not crazy and they're not just drifting alone through this sea of disconnected people and disconnected ideas. And I really want the conference to be a place where people come together and are able to share ideas and to find people that are interested in the same things that they're interested in, so that they're not just by themselves with their deeply specific interests.
Man, I say it all the time too. The patron chat's one of my favorite times of the week. I know it's one of your favorite times too, but I'm so stoked for this conference to just be able to hang out with people, meet the people that are into the kind of conversations that we have, to talk, just to really be absorbing their energies, right? Because we go out in the world here and it's like, it's so sad, not sad, but nobody cares about these things when you talk to somebody at the grocery store, or talk to, even our friends who are into music or whatever. It's like, it's so comforting to hang out with people that are fascinated by the same topics as us in this little nerdling domain that we preoccupy ourselves with.
Yeah. And not only that, but I think that it gives us the opportunity to really start to change the culture of how people talk about science. Because watching that quote-unquote debate last night just kind of turned my stomach, because I think that that's how people talked in the past. where you know that there's tons of stories of people showing up at conferences and having these really aggressive fights and telling each other how stupid they were and how they didn't understand anything. And I think that the kind of ad hominem centered conversation was really common, and it still kind of is. And I find myself falling into that trap because I, again, grew up in a family where that was the mode of discourse was super aggressive. And I have been slowly training myself out of that over the course of the last 30 odd years.
Yeah, it would be kind of badass if we could get somebody to oppose our keynote speaker. Because if we have a really amazing keynote speaker. I don't want to tell y'all who it is just yet, but it's one of my favorite living scientists. And I would love to get somebody who opposed that perspective, but could do it in a really respectful, amazing way. And we could actually maybe show the world how a scientific conversation should happen. One where it's two people against a problem, not two people against each other. That would be completely badass. So we should start thinking about who we could get to do that.
Right, because if Farina and Tour had been able to come together to be like, hey, there are pretty serious problems with origin of life research, and lots of people are working on them, and nobody seems to be solving it. Let's see what we can come up with together by pooling our expertise and our knowledge in order to be able to move the ball down the field or whatever. That's a sports metaphor. I think they do that in sports, right?
I guess the hard part is they have to agree that there is a problem, right? And it's like...
As I'm saying that, I'm realizing that because I'm like, they fundamentally couldn't agree that there was a problem because Tour seems to be motivated to discredit origin of life research, and Farina seems motivated to defend origin of life research, and those are their primary motivations.
Yeah, so we'd have to find somebody who was open to the fact that there might be unanswered questions in that discipline. I think we can do it.
Well, we got until April 6th.
We'll figure it out.
Okay.
But yeah, folks, block off your calendars. The eclipse is happening on April 8th. We're going to be down in Austin, Texas. We're going to rent a theater or something, maybe get a lecture hall at the university, and we're going to do this conference type thing. And I want it to be a really amazing, transformative experience. I want to get, music and lights, and I'm not imagining Burning Man or anything, but I do want it to be a really special event. And there's going to be so much cool stuff happening that weekend, too. Austin's just absolutely banging town lately. There's so much good comedy. There's always been really good music in Austin. I think we'll probably play some music down there, play a show. So, yeah, think about it, guys. Think about it if you could make it out to Austin next April. It's going to be something else. And then I guess we were gonna talk a little bit about this book we were working on, but let's. I
think we should do a dedicated conversation about that.
Yeah, I was gonna say we have our buddy Oliver has offered to basically interview us about it.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So he's on vacation right now. When he gets back, we're gonna film an episode, and he can just pick our brains about it because we haven't really talked about that stuff on this channel too much. So let's save it for then.
Yeah. See you next time, guys.